Thank you, Kemi. Many familiar faces in this room, which is great. Hopefully what today does is it will push a little bit of your thinking of that based on that little feeling you get in your gut when I say the word online health rating, because I know that it's a little bit of pain, it's a little bit of frustration, it's a little bit of disbelief at each point. But I think it's important to think about these online health ratings in the context of healthcare delivery, what it means for quality, what it means for safety, and where these are going in the next decade. As disclosures, the primary one Kemi mentioned, I do work under contract with CMS through CORE for the development of hospital outcome efficiency measures, particularly the STAR ratings program, and then I have some other research funding. So this is Google 2006. I was a second-year medical student. If I Googled doctors or hospital, this is what I would primarily see, and it would make sense because most of the time between class was discussing things like Grey's Anatomy. This is 2016. The online footprint of what is healthcare has rapidly expanded, and it is now not just the famous and the celebrity, but it's every single person in this room. I would bet that if any of you were to Google yourself, there is some healthcare-related information about you on the first 10 hits on Google. If you go to the images, it's going to be at the top of the page. And the information comes from a variety of sources. It is things that we associate with healthcare, like CMS's Hospital Compare, the Leapfrog Group. It's organizations that started off rating cars or vacuum cleaners, like Consumer Reports, and then started doing healthcare. And then it's even Facebook and Yelp. The challenge is that this information comes across a whole spectrum. So I Googled myself about a month ago before I gave a talk at the National Emergency Medicine meeting, and this was one of the first 15 websites that came up as a rating about me. I have no idea where this information came from, but there's numbers on it. Evidently, when it comes to emergency appointment access, I get a 3.6. I work in the emergency department. If I'm there, we're there 24/7. You can get in any time. When it comes to listening and answering questions, I got a 4.4. I don't know anything about this system. I couldn't find anything on this website about what it was. But the one thing I did like was it did use the word most famous to describe me at the very top. A couple links down, Vitals. Many of you may have heard about this. It's a very consumer-oriented website. They try to integrate a lot of information for patients, rate doctors. They initially tried off being the Angie's List of healthcare at the beginning. I'm a little worried about this one because this website is still active and lists me as a medical student. And so I think when people see this type of information, when you see these stories, when you hear and you look up yourself once, you immediately start asking this question of where does this data come from? What does it mean? Do patients really care? How do you get above all that noise of everything that's on the internet? And I would start by saying that patients do really want to know. And so many of you may have heard of Pew, particularly coming off an election season where they conduct many political polls. They are a nonpartisan organization that is known for their surveying of American opinion on a variety of subjects. A couple years ago, they started doing an annual survey on Americans' use of online health information. And what was one of the first things they found was that 72% of adults in the US at the time look online for healthcare quality information. What's really impressive is that 3/4 of them start with a search engine. And right now, I would imagine for the vast majority of people in this room, that's Google. And so if I were to Google best hospital in Connecticut, what do I see? I get top of the list, a US News link. Below that, a Consumer Reports link, a couple news reports. And this is how most people start when they're looking for healthcare information. This is only going to grow. In a separate survey that was done that looked at how old people were and where they were looking for information, the interesting thing was this. The most common thing to look for online, not surprisingly, drugs or medical treatments. Really easy to look for information because you know exactly what to type in. After that, doctors, and then just below that, hospitals and other medical facilities. What's interesting is that the big group here is those that are in the 30 to 49 segment. And those are folks who haven't really hit their peak of personal health care utilization, hospital care, doctor care. All of that will come in the next 20 years. And so you can expect that the number of people and the number of patients you talk to that are looking for information online about hospital quality, doctor quality, is all only going in one direction. What do they look for? First thing that people look for? Quality. What does that mean? We'll talk about it in a little bit. Second thing, people look for ratings. Why? It's confusing. Everything in healthcare is confusing. The vast majority of concepts, topics, things that we've got information available on are so intimidating and overwhelming to folks. The idea of a summary measurement or something that can make it a little bit easier for them to understand is remarkably attractive. Patient experience usually follows that, and then to some degree demographics. And what you find in qualitative research is that's often people looking for providers that can speak the same language or things along those lines. And when do people look? Most often, they're looking before. 61% of people look online before they go see a doctor. 20% to evaluate the person they have just seen or seeing, and 19% after the visit. This fits with the general concept that has been kind of purported for a lot of these websites and a lot of this online healthcare information, right? It's built on this idea that people will choose their healthcare providers, be it a physician or a hospital. And in general, people are saying, yeah, we're looking first, we look before. There's a bunch of different ratings out there, and I put this one up first because it's probably the most famous and it's the one that people have heard about the most. The US News and World Report. Anybody have a guess as to where I downloaded the middle list from? UCSF, not surprisingly, right? People will put these up the second they come out when it's valuable for marketing. And the methodologies of each hospital rating system and online rating system could turn into a 15-hour lecture. And so what I've tried to do is simply say that for a few of the big ones, I'll try to summarize what they are largely based on and what they largely glean. So in the US News case, every hospital in America gets a score between 0 and 100, easy to understand. That score is based on 4 big categories. Category first up there is reputation. That's 28% of the score. How do they figure out that reputation? It's based largely on survey and to some degree a few other intangible things they measure. Second big category they measure, survival. What is survival? That is performance on CMS, hospital mortality measures. Those are measures that were initially developed down the street at the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation here. They're common measures across a lot of these rating systems. Safety, they weight at 5%. What are those based on? Again, similar measures that are used in national programs to quantitatively assess a hospital safety score. And then they've got this other category of 30%, which is like a mishmash of some structural things, what's the hospital's nurse-patient ratio, a variety of other elements that they've selected. The methodology has evolved. It's different. It's different now than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, this really started off as a reputation survey. And so it's been a big change for the US News and World Report to work in these additional metrics and numbers along the way. But most people reflect on this and say that the reputation is really what drives a lot of the variation between how hospitals do. So this is Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports, about 10 years ago, got into the idea of recognizing that their already subscribers had a tremendous amount of interest in healthcare information, and that it wasn't just consumer appliances or cars or other products along those lines. And so they initially started developing some rating systems around Consumer Reports based on a variety of data sources. Theirs is different. The Consumer Reports data doesn't include any survey. It doesn't include any information that comes via a reputational score or something like that. But it includes a narrower set of measures on certain topics. And it gets that information from the Joint Commission. It gets it from data sets available from the American Hospital Association or from the metrics that CMS uses. And so as you can see on this was before my Consumer Reports subscription ended about a year ago. And so at that point, Yale was still not rated. But it shows you often hospitals that are nearby, shows that around here, the other hospitals have a score around 50 to 60. Again, they do it on the 0 to 100 scale. But you see that what they're really focusing on are things such as avoiding infections. So it's the same measures around hospital-acquired infections that are used by CMS in quality reporting programs that are embedded into these Consumer Reports scores, and to a smaller degree in something like a US News score. It's the last one that's sort of well known in the healthcare space, the Leapfrog group. So the Leapfrog group comes at this from a very different angle. The Leapfrog group was initially an organization focused solely on patient safety. And when they first started, the way they began was by sending out a survey as an organization that largely represents purchasers of healthcare. They sent out a survey to every hospital and asked them to voluntarily fill it out regarding a variety of questions about whether or not they had certain processes in place regarding safety of care. And then eventually they recognized that there was a tremendous amount of value in transparency and interest, I should say, in transparency around that information. And so a couple years ago, they started releasing that information in the form of a safety score. And so they have a national distribution where the vast majority of hospitals do get a C. It's based on two things. Primarily, their proprietary survey, so a once-a-year assessment of what you're doing on certain safety practices, not based on patient data, but just on do you have certain things in place, what ratio do you have of nurses, again, things like that. And it is focused only on safety. It does not include other measures of things such as mortality, efficiency, things along those domains. This is an example of a page from the Yale page. This is the one where we do very well at having a few amount of iatrogenic venous ulcers, but we do poorly on falls. Ultimately, the score at Yale was a 0.33 on a scale where the higher the number, the worse. That's that many events per 1,000 discharges. And so I close with that one because I think you have to think about the patient safety movement at the same time that you think about the online rating movement. And this is a news story that tells that story.
John James used to be the chief toxicologist at NASA, helping protect astronauts in space. But his mission changed in 2002 after he lost his son, Alex. James says the teenager died of cardiac arrest after doctors misdiagnosed him.
He was 6 days short of his 20th birthday.
James went on to start Patient Safety America. A recent study from his group found medical errors are linked to 440,000 deaths every year.
I want to emphasize it's an estimate. My goal is to educate folks about the risks of healthcare across the board.
A new analysis from Consumer Reports finds those risks can depend on which hospital you choose. They scored more than 2,500 hospitals nationwide on a safety scale from 1 to 100, and there was a wide variation. For example, Bolivar Medical Center in Mississippi only received an 11, while Miles Memorial Hospital in Maine received the highest score, a 78.
Higher rated hospitals have lower death rates, have lower readmission rates, they have lower rates of hospital-acquired infections. So all the things that you don't want to happen to you are, in general, lower in those hospitals.
We all make mistakes, doctors included.
James says it's important people find out which hospitals are less likely to make those mistakes. Jerika Duncan, CBS News, New York.
I show that story also because I think there is a gut reaction on our part when we think about online health information or transparency of healthcare information to immediately somehow equate that in our head with patient satisfaction, right? That it is all about how good the food was, how comfortable the place looked, and things along those lines, and not necessarily to tie it to the same narrative that we think about with healthcare quality and safety. But that is really where this push comes from. It is the same impetus and push for transparency around quality and safety that wants transparency for a lot of these ratings. The idea that as this information becomes more available, we can understand how we perform, understand our quality and safety, benchmark against others, and that in some way that also targets and creates an impetus for change in certain areas in healthcare. So the challenge is this. This is a study that was in Health Affairs last year. I just put up 3 different rating systems for you. And they all, we talked about, had a completely different set of assumptions, focus, data sources. And so what you end up with is very different results. And so this, Matt Austin down at Hopkins just did a simple study where he took a rating for the 1,000 or so hospitals that were part of the Leapfrog survey, that got a US News rating, that got a Consumer Reports rating, and I believe a Health Grades rating, and found that no hospital was rated as a high performer by all 4 national rating systems, and that only 10% of the 844 hospitals were rated as a high performance by one rating system were also high by another. So you could take two conclusions from that. You could take conclusion one, that this must all be bogus because the answer isn't right every time. The other conclusion you could take from that is just to recognize that this is probably true for almost every other product and almost every other thing you evaluate and look at in life for a couple reasons. Just like when you're looking for a car, you have different priorities, preferences, and values on different aspects of that car than somebody else. In the same way, the rating systems are inherently set up to have different priorities and preferences between them. And they reflect the organizations they're coming from, right? The Leapfrog group has decided that they primarily are focused on patient safety, and patient safety from the perspective of purchasers of healthcare. And so they have solely said that we'll design a rating system that helps people understand that problem. There are patients out there, there's consumers out there, there's purchasers out there, there's hospitals out there that may not necessarily think that that's the most important thing. In that case, that's not the rating system for you. If what you care about is reputation, right? Maybe the US News rating system makes the most sense. And so the important thing to recognize is I think that each of these reflect the organizations they come from and the assumptions of what they've prioritized within them. It's for sure the beginning of a wave, though, and I say this because it's in the vein of transparency. When increasingly patients are asked about one of the primary challenges they find in the healthcare system, they will talk about the lack of information. Yes, they may be confused. Yes, the information may be intimidating, but it is the lack of transparency and the lack of information that precludes their ability to make decisions. In recent years, most of that attention has been on price transparency. You see that in the survey, which comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers. They're a big accounting firm. They do a lot of consumer and got a lot of consumer surveys, and this comes from that. But number two, right below price, is high quality ratings by other customers. Number three behind that, which is what helps people make decisions, is high quality ratings by government or other well-known agencies. Below that, word of mouth, and then brand name. And I think that this is important to recognize because it reflects the fact that nobody's making a decision based on just one rating. They're looking at multiple sources of information, but that increasingly people want transparency and they want more information to help them make those decisions. And so the thing that I always close with when I look at these online hospital ratings, I say is there's some things that are just the same across all of them. Most of them now do include some CMS measures of hospital quality. Some of them, therefore, are often specific to Medicare beneficiaries when they look at that quality. They're all going to include some data that's either based on chart reviews or on administrative claims or insurance data. They're only going to capture a portion of all hospital events. No single metric, no rating system can ever capture the complexity and the breadth of everything that happens at this hospital or many hospitals around the country. And none of them involve stratification. None of them change their score when they compare a big hospital to a little hospital, a teaching hospital to a non-teaching hospital. And that's largely because I think we often think of the world that way more than patients do. The difference between each of these is whether or not they've got proprietary data or not, the measures they select and how they repackage them, and often whether or not they're including patient reviews. And so the last rating system I'll talk about is Hospital Compare. In some ways, Hospital Compare is that government source of rating. It is that government source of quality information. It is built in a way where it has more public transparency than any other system. It has to be vetted in a variety of ways. It has to be reviewed in a variety of ways. And so this was what the Yale New Haven Hospital website would look like on Hospital Compare prior to July 2016. You would go to this website, you could see where the hospital was, a few basic structural characteristics, and then there was a tab for each of the measures that many people in this room are probably intimately aware of or have heard of a little peripherally. The HCAHPS surveys of patient experiences, readmissions, mortality measures, a variety of measures. July 2016, this changed. And so what was added, you can see, is that overall rating, a star rating. And so Yale got 3 stars. This is the work that we led up at CORE, so I'm probably certainly conflicted and biased when I present this, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about the methodology, the thinking that went into it, to help people understand how to interpret that result. When you click on the website, underneath the overall rating, you can ask for more details. And the star rating that CMS is using is based on 7 domains of quality: mortality, safety of care, readmissions, patient experience, effectiveness of care, timeliness of care, and the use of imaging. These are all existing measures that have been part of Hospital Compare and were individually reported. This is merely an aggregation of a hospital's performance on them. And so not surprisingly, like anything you would imagine, if I just say something is 3 stars, there's more under the hood. And there are certain aspects of that the hospital performs better on publicly reported measures, and certain aspects of that where hospital performs worse than others on these publicly reported measures. So why did they do this? 2 reasons. First, the number of measures that are collected and publicly reported has grown astronomically in the last decade. So the first public reporting of any measure was essentially around the end of, was in 2005. The first reporting of an outcome measure of a hospital was 2007. And this just goes to show you what the total number of measures are as they increase till 2014. I can tell you now this number, as we stand here in January of 2017, is about 105 or 110 measures that are publicly reported on Hospital Compare by CMS. The interesting thing here, though, is it wasn't purely additive. Over this past decade, there's probably been 20 or 30 measures that were retired or removed. And so there's probably been something on the neighborhood of 150 or 160 measures of quality that have been at some various part of the life cycle, part of the Hospital Compare website. And so what did that do? It has pushed a lot of hospitals to target and focus quality improvement efforts, but it was just too much for patients. And so as CMS would go out and talk to patients, convene focus groups, listen to what they said, show them the website, they would look at it and they would say 2 things. Yes, I care about this information. 2, I don't understand it at all. The terms were too much, risk standardized readmission rate. There was too many metrics for them to be able to look at and get their hands around it. And what would initially happen is as folks would look at that information, they would essentially get scared away at the very beginning. And so the purpose of the star ratings was to create accessibility. It was to create a single summary rating, acknowledging that, yes, it takes a complex system of healthcare with so many complex processes and outcomes that are measured, and tries to put it into a single rating. And that will never be perfect. But can it be done in a way that you can generate a measure that allows patients to find this information a little more accessible? Is it in a way where patients could use it to ask a question, for them to understand a little bit more about hospital quality, to allow this to get elevated on their agenda when they're thinking about which hospital to go to? And that was what the Affordable Care Act asked for as well. It had language asking CMS to make this information more accessible and and facilitate its communication to both patients, consumers, and particularly Medicare beneficiaries. And so there was 5 guiding principles in the development of CMS's star ratings. It had followed all this work already being done, right? The Consumer Reports rating was already up. Leapfrog had their rating. US News had their rating. There's probably 10 at least private other companies that are rating hospitals I didn't even mention. And so we looked for common things across those that we thought were important principles to bring to the work for CMS. The first was to try to make the final product simple and accessible. It doesn't mean that every step along the way has to be simple and accessible, but for the intended audience, patients and consumers and their families, it needed to be simple and accessible. We sought to be inclusive. There's 100-odd measures of quality on Hospital Compare. How do we pick amongst those to be ideal for what patients are looking for? We wanted it to be scientifically rigorous. We wanted to engage stakeholders. We did a lot of work with patients in this work from the very beginning. Before we even started the methodology, we had a patient and patient advocate work group that worked with us the entire way through the project, as well as a technical expert panel, included national experts that came from every walk of life. Hospital CMOs and VPs of quality, to research methodologists, to patient advocacy organizations, big purchasing organizations. And then we tried to make it consistent with what CMS had on its other websites. We are here, work in a hospital. We think of the world in a hospital lens. The vast majority of time, hopefully, our patients are not here. They do not think about the hospital. They don't want to think about the hospital, but they spend a lot of time thinking about a variety of other settings where they receive services from CMS, nursing homes, home health care. There's also star rating systems for those as well. And so the 2 things I think are important to remember as key considerations, I'm sure people have questions about these, are this. First, You can only reflect the quality in these summary ratings based on what you already have measures on. I recognize there are things in healthcare and quality measures in healthcare that either don't exist, or if they existed, they're not publicly reported by CMS, so we don't know that those happen, and we can't measure those in a valid, reliable way across every hospital to include that information. And so the summary measure is as good as what we measure today, which are largely measures of common care, right? We don't look at how good a hospital is at transplants or their LVAD outcomes. What we look at is how good hospitals do on pneumonia, heart failure, COPD, AMI, common conditions, hip replacements. And then the other thing to remember is that each hospital is different. And so we knew this from the very beginning, right? You have hospitals that are on the CMS Hospital Compare website that may have a total of 40 beds, maybe even 25 beds, that are reporting 15, 20 quality measures per year. And then you've got folks like us on the other end of the spectrum, over 1,000 beds, 50, 60 quality measures that get included. And so this is the general schematic of how the methodology works. Step 1, you select measures. Amongst that 100 that exist out there, about 64 met the criteria to be included. Step 2, you take those measures and you put them in 7 buckets of quality. Quality isn't one thing, it's probably at least these things and more things. These are the ones that we measure right now. We then use a statistical model to give a score for each of these aspects of quality. Step 4, you combine each of those 7 scores into one score, one number, and then you cluster it into 5 groupings. And that's the end grade, 5-star ratings. So step 1, how do you select these measures? This is an example from October of 2016. There's 150 measures on the Hospital Compare website. 13 of those were either getting retired, delayed. These are the measures, like I said before. As evidence starts to show that you don't need this measure anymore because everybody's already getting an A+, or as evidence starts to show that maybe the measure has unintended consequences, these get removed. There are some measures with fewer than 100 of the 4,700 hospitals in America reporting them. We take those out. We take out structural measures. And this is something that's interesting. Listening both to patients and experts, people said, just because your hospital participates in a registry doesn't mean it's high quality. Or, while there is a clear volume-outcome relationship for a lot of things in healthcare, the measures don't measure it that way. And so those measures aren't included in the star rating. We take out measures where it's not clear if a higher or lower score is better. It has to have a direction. And then we take out some measures that are either they're duplicative, and that's just inside baseball in policy world right now. And so these get grouped on these 7 topics. And so you could ask, well, how did you pick these 7? We picked these 7 to be consistent with current groupings of measures. I will tell you, in our work with patients and patient advocates, they will tell you they do not see the world through these 7 groups. And that's one of the real challenges we had to deal with when we were developing this. If we were to wait for every measure to only be patient-driven and start with a patient idea, we'd have to wait a decade before we could do another rating. And so you have to be pragmatic and deal with what you can do now to help meet that original goal of making this information accessible and to facilitate it, but at the same time work with what you have. And so we grouped the measures by clinically reasonable categories. We vetted this with the expert panel. They agreed. These are how these measures are presented on the website now. And you can see there's somewhere between 5 and 15 odd measures of mortality, safety of care, readmission, patient experience. 2 of these groups, the effectiveness and timeless ones, are process metrics of care. They're not outcomes. And then the use of imaging. And then we calculated what's called a latent variable model. I promise this is the only math that we're going to talk about in this entire talk. And the reason I think it's worth explaining it is I think it helps you understand a little bit behind what's under the hood and hopefully makes people a little more comfortable with what it is that's actually going on here. And so what is a latent variable model? At its most basic level, it's an indirect measure of something that's unobserved, a latent construct. In our case, hospital quality, or really specifically, hospital quality with respect to survival or mortality. How good is that hospital at saving people's lives? I don't have one measure of that. There's no single measure that tells me about that quality. What I do have is several individual other measures, though. I have a measure of a hospital's mortality rate for heart attacks. I have a measure of their mortality rate for pneumonia. I have a measure of their mortality rate after surgeries. And each of those tell me something little bit about that unobserved quality of mortality. And that's what the whole concept is based on when we build these statistical models. This is a common example. This is actually from Wikipedia. This is the most common example people use when they're talking about latent variable models, and people get it. People love trying to measure intelligence. Really hard to do it. But why do they want to measure intelligence? Because they're trying to also measure academic performance. And so we know those things are highly correlated. Point 8, intelligence and academic performance. But if I were to just look at somebody and say, hey, measure academic performance for me, we would each come up with a completely different rating system, right? What we do know is that there are measures that we do observe, real numbers that I can measure. There's no such thing as an academic performance scale, but there is an SAT score. There's a high school GPA, and there's an ACT score. And we know that all those things are correlated. That how well you do on the SAT probably is people who do better on their GPA, is also people who do better on the ACT, lets us know that those people are more likely to do better in academic performance. And so the construct is similar for each of these models. And so there's one per each of those groups I showed you. And so in the case of mortality, I have these 7 measures of hospital mortality rates. Individually, each of these measures is already risk adjusted. It accounts for differences in the comorbidities of patient, the age of patient, things along those lines. And then we say that I know something about that hospital's quality when it comes to survival and saving lives based on the information in each of these. Not all those arrows are the same size. Some arrows are bigger, some are smaller. And the reason is that within the model, what it looks for is how much each of those measures is correlated with all the other measures in the model. And the more correlated that measure is with the other measures, the more we believe it reflects what that latent or unobserved variable is, that latent aspect of hospital quality, in this case mortality. And so the mortality example, the heart failure mortality measure, is highly correlated with all the 6 other ones. And so that's why it has the highest loading. PSI-4, this is a measure of surgical death, death after surgery, less correlated with these other ones, it contributes less to the hospital score. And so 7 of these models are set up. You can see latent group 1, latent group 7 there. 7 separate statistical models, 1 for each group of quality. You group the 7 scores into 1, and you're at step 4 where you get the summary score. This, to me, is the biggest policy decision that we made in the development of this methodology. People get really hung up on the math sometimes. They get really hung up on the small details. But this is what determines what star rating a hospital actually gets in the end. This is the part that when I showed you those previous systems, I showed you Leapfrog, I showed you US News, and we said it's merely a reflection of the priorities and of the goals and the preferences of the organization making the rating. In this case, it's CMS, and CMS has said in their quality strategy that outcomes matter more than process, and that patient experience is as important as any other outcome. And so that's why the initial weights that were used are 22% for those 3 outcome groups in the patient experience group, and measures of processes of care. Did you give an aspirin on arrival for an AMI? What was their emergency department throughput? What was the use of MRI in back pain? These process measures are weighted much less. In the last step, these are clustered into 5 stars. And so I won't get into the math of k-means clustering, but ultimately this is the distribution you get. It does look like a bell curve. It doesn't have to. If certain hospitals change and a lot of hospitals got better at those individual measures, it wouldn't look like this. But almost half the hospitals in the country get 3 stars. Some more get 4 than 2, and then very few hospitals get 1 star and 5 star. And why is that? It is remarkably hard and almost impossible for hospitals to do really well at safety outcomes, mortality outcomes, and readmission outcomes, but some still do, right? So it is doable, but it is really hard to do. And that's why there's so few 5-star hospitals. This gets back to what I was saying originally, though. Patients may not view that rating system in the same lens that I just gave it to you in. I gave you a conceptual model where I said hospital quality has 7 aspects to it, that we can bucket hospital quality into these 7 groups. That's the 7 things that matter, and that's how we're going to measure it. But that's not only maybe not true broadly, it is certainly different patient by patient by patient. For some people, mortality might have been needed to weight 80% and readmission 10%. For somebody else, patient experience might be 100%. They don't even care about the other categories. And so it's in that world and the democratization of information and transparency that you've got other places that make information available. And so the consulting firm that did a survey where I showed you data early about who's looking at information, how often do they look for information online, number one place that people look for information about healthcare quality, Yelp. Right? Surprising. The funny thing about this is the survey is now about 1.5 years old. I would bet this has already changed, if it mirrors my dinner habits at all. RateMD's up there, Vital's up there. But there's a tremendous amount of shift and interest because this stuff hits the top of Google. It's easy to click on. It's already familiar to you. You understand what it is, and it provides unstructured data. Patients love reading other people's narratives, and they are smart at interpreting them as well, right? People are used to now being on the internet and interpreting what other people wrote about a restaurant, a product, something on Amazon. They will interpret what you write about a hospital or a doctor in the same way. They're going to read it and they're going to be like, oh, this person sounds totally crazy. I'm not listening to this at all, right? Or they're going to read it and be like, that sounds like me, that resonates with me, and they find that valuable. More so probably than a lot of the quantitative information that we try to summarize and present to them. And so this is obviously the funny side of it, right? To say that I picked my plastic surgeon on 2 negative reviews on Yelp. When I gave an earlier version of this and I started thinking about how Yelp interacted with people's views of health ratings and quality, about 1 year ago, the Yale New Haven Hospital only had 11 reviews on Yelp. I redid the search today, and I am proud to say we're up to 30. 3 times as much information available about the hospital in the last year. I'm sure if I looked at almost any restaurant going down Chapel Street, though, I could quickly beat that. But it starts to show you what kind of information's up there. A lot of people might look at this and say, oh, 30 reviews, that's nothing. A lot of people won't. There's a little bit more information up there. It has what they call the ER wait time. That's actually the CMS number that gets reported once a year to CMS. That's the number that ends up on Yelp now as to what the wait time is. I can promise you it is not 26 minutes at 5:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. And so here's a couple patient reviews of the world I work in, the emergency department. Right? First one was fairly last September. Came here for late night food poisoning. Emergency service was prompt. Didn't like the atmosphere. Not surprising. They definitely need to hire some cleaners. Hope I'll never revisit this place. I get that. Who wants to be in the emergency department? Who wants to come back? But a lot of people see that, and she gave it 3 stars. Somebody else, 3 years ago, says, I will never be going here again. They came the first week of new interns, as you can see. The emergency room staff was mediocre. I was left alone for long periods of time without anyone telling me what was going on. No one would let me call my parents to let them know I was in the hospital. The worst of it, though, were definitely the nurses. I always believed that most nurses were kind, understanding people who chose the career because they truly cared. Wrong. They were rude, spent most of the time on their phones, completely ignored me when I was crying out in pain. The challenge here is this. I would bet you the nurses were remarkably compassionate and caring of this patient, right? But we know that in healthcare, we're thinking about that patient for that 2 minutes that we're in the room, we're going in and out. They were probably looking at their mobile heartbeat phone the second they went outside. Patients don't see that, right? If you put yourself in the shoes of patients and in the lens of patients, this is how they see healthcare. And what I was really trying to understand as I was looking at our reviews is what makes the difference between a review that is positive, one that is negative, a higher rating and a lower rating. I was particularly interested because if we go back to this homepage, right now for some reason picture number 2 on our Yelp homepage is our sushi with salmon and veggies. And so I kind of wanted to go find whose review that was, right? And that's the bottom one here. And it says, I've had excellent people working on my boyfriend while he's been here after his 2nd liver surgery. Dr. Chan's team have done a fantastic job. The nurses and hospital in Smilo have been outstanding. We're partial to Shane on the 15th floor, but they're all excellent. So a very positive review about that patient's experience. What's interesting here is 2 liver surgeries. This is complex care. A patient who is probably only going to be able to get care at Yale and nowhere else in the entire area. This is where Yale is the destination hospital. But that same patient is still the person posting the picture of sushi when they think about their positive feelings for the Yale New Haven Hospital. And the reason I bring that up is when we talk to patients and we've asked them about these ratings, one thing that truly comes through is this. I think as clinicians, as physicians, nurses, whatever it may be, we often think that I did a great job, we provided great quality care, but because some affective dimension of the quality, the sushi was bad, we're getting a bad rating. And I actually don't think that's the case. I think that the base expectation we have heard from patients, and when we look at the reviews and things along those lines, are that the care has got to be good, that they do and are able to discern the quality of care. And that to some degree is actually expected, a high quality. And that when you come to the brand of an institution like Yale, that it's an even higher bar probably of quality that's expected, and that the sushi is just icing on top of the cake. That's the difference between a nice 5-star, but probably a 4 or 5 stars anyways, if the quality was good, because that's the number one thing people are looking for when they look at these ratings. And so there's some research on this. A group at Penn recently did a study looking at Yelp reviews and how they correlated with the HCAHPS ratings, which we often use to assess patient experience after hospital discharge. And I think 2 things stuck to me out on this one. The first was it only took 3 Yelp reviews for them to predict a hospital's patient experience score. This goes counter to what most of us think. I am used to getting 4 or 5 Press Ganey surveys, and I look at that and I say, oh, what does this mean? It's just 5 people, right? Very easy to say. It's very easy to say, oh, well, this month we didn't get a lot of HCAHPS surveys back. Or what does that tell us about that hospital? They only submitted 100 surveys for the whole year, right? It appears that how we do with even a few folks really does reflect the experience. The vocal minority does seem to predict our performance on a lot of these measures. And then the second thing is this. We've worked from a world in patient experience where we said that HCAHPS was the gold standard. We've said that we look at all these other new ratings and things like that, and we compare it to how we do on HCAHPS. But what if it goes the other way? What if HCAHPS is the deficient tool and Yelp is actually the superior tool? And so what they found is when they were looking through the contents and they read every review for every patient on a bunch of these hospitals, they found there's 3 things that you can measure through Yelp that you actually can't measure in HCAHPS. 3 things that I think everybody in this room would agree are at the core of a lot of the patient-centered work and patient-centered mission here. Compassion, kindness, and empathy. Things you can't survey somebody on necessarily a month later when they get a survey in the mail, but something that people will give you that emotional response to when they write a review online. What about Facebook? We're doing well here, 4.3 stars on Facebook. A lot of 5s, 512, a lot more reviews than we're getting on Yelp. And the data again shows that strong Facebook response for hospitals seems to be associated with their outcome measure performance. Hospitals that do well on Facebook have lower unplanned readmission rates. And so I say this, and we have to take this with some grain of salt. This is a rapidly changing and evolving environment. This is the percentage of people that consulted an online reviewer ranking before they went to a hospital. It's 18, 17, 14%, 14% for hospitals. How many people posted? 3%. What are those numbers today? Probably already very different from this 2-year-old survey. But the reality is this. It will be a vocal minority of people, probably, that will continue to post this information. But eventually that 3% of posters will become 5, quickly 10, easily 20. Every one of these companies is rapidly developing new technology to make it easier and faster to rate things. It is not uncommon now to walk into a restaurant, for Yelp to use the location services on where you are, and to send you an immediate survey to review that restaurant and give you $2 off your meal at the same time. The same will likely be employed in the healthcare setting. It's a tremendous incentive for them to crowdsource information and get it quickly. And so there's a couple ways you can respond to this. As well, I'll close with. One way is the way a lot of doctors initially responded to online ratings, and this got a Washington Post article. They tried to sue the raters, or sue the people that wrote a review about them online. That did not go well. Millions of dollars were lost, and I can promise you that the patients and consumers, and this is in a world with even less focus on transparency than we have now, this is 4 years ago, easily won in court. The other approach to this is what Vivian Lee wrote about. She's a radiologist and the CEO of the University of Utah Healthcare System. They've done a tremendous amount of work on a variety of topics, quality, safety, price transparency at Utah over the past 4 or 5 years, and a lot we can learn from. And she wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review that I think is worth reading, and it was about the idea of why doctors shouldn't be afraid of online reviews and why her hospital and her health system not only has embraced these ratings, but have put out their own ratings. They have developed their own ratings of quality on a variety of things that they know other people are never going to rate them on. So their specialty services, their referral services, what they've done on care coordination and efficiency, and they've put that information out to the public fast, and they make it accessible on people's phones, computer, you name it. And so she wrote, they, and she meant the patients here, are voting with their feet and casting their ballots with institutions they trust. Those that give them the information they need to make wise healthcare decisions, and those that deliver the best care and service for the lowest possible cost. Why is it that in industry we persist in fooling ourselves that customer satisfaction doesn't matter? The patient defines value, and the sooner we come to terms with that, the better. And so this is an example I want to give, thinking about that, of something that somebody forwarded me recently on YouTube. This is a hospital called St. Elizabeth Hospital. They're in Belleville, Illinois. They're a small to medium-sized community hospital. They initially, in July of 2016, had a 2-star rating on the CMS star ratings. I looked it up a couple days ago, and they're now up to 3 stars. Very few hospitals have been able to change their star rating within a couple quarters, but they're one of them. And this is a local news story that was in which they were interviewed by I think a local CBS affiliate, if I remember right.
So we're excited that the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services is looking for ways to inform consumers. We think that that's a good thing. And they maybe have oversimplified the process, but we understand what a 1-star is versus a 5-star. So I think their attempt is laudable. I think it's one of many tools that a patient should use when they're making decisions on quality, and we think this is one.
No, the only thing I would add is that CMS announced a long time ago, I remember hearing the head of CMS give a talk about their goal for Medicare beneficiaries is to have really 3 things. One, that a Medicare beneficiary can directly access some sort of common source that says, hey, what's the quality of your provider, whether it's hospital or doctor, because those ratings are coming out. Number 2, what is the patient experience rating? I mean, in terms of satisfaction with the doctor or with the hospital. And then 3rd is, what's the cost? And their goal was 100% transparency, and we're fully supportive of that. So this is the beginning. It requires a lot of modification, and there'll be some bumps along the road, but they're on the right track in terms of starting that journey.
So there are many different ratings that we look at to aspire to assure that we're serving our patients and their families. So we think that this is one of many. The important piece also to note is the time period by which the various 7 sections of the measures are date frames. So we're aspiring going forward, not just looking in the past. And so it just inspires us to continue to serve our patients and to excel in quality.
And so I get to see a lot of the fan mail on the star ratings, and that's not what it's always like. But I do think it acknowledges the fact that there's a lot of limitations to these rating systems. There's a lot of challenges within them, but it is really important to think about as healthcare leaders and organizational leaders how you're going to respond to that information and respond to it amidst a much bigger, broader trend, like I said, in which quality transparency is moving really fast. If you think that it feels like there's a lot out there now, it will only go up. Look at how little people care now when emails get leaked. There's a debate about who leaked them and should they have been leaked, but nobody really feels bad for the DNC people whose emails are out there. Nobody's saying, oh man, I feel really bad that their private emails got leaked. There is such an acceptance of and push for transparency, particularly in a world where we have increasing distrust for a variety of institutions, that this trend will only grow. And the availability of information will also only grow. And patients are going to start, I think, seeking mass customization here. And when I say that, what do I mean? I mean 2 things. One is this business concept where you standardize in a way that you can get economies of scale, make things widely available, and get common definitions. But you also customize in a way that people get something personalized. And so what I showed you today was a world in which online health ratings and hospital ratings were standardized within, certainly not standardized across, everybody's measuring something different, and not customized at all. But what if the world instead allowed you to go to that website and say, What's the most important domain to you? Mortality. What's second most important to you? Patient experience. What else do you care about? Nothing else. Okay, here are star ratings for you for every hospital in this country. And I think that that is where this will go. Right? The purpose of this is not to necessarily put the grade down and say that you're a 4, you're a 3, you're a 5. That's not the goal. The goal of this is to try to get patients to use this information to think about variability and quality as something that should affect their choice of hospital, their choice of physician. And that's where starting to get to that world where you start to meet patient preferences and values and goals and their personal objectives will start to play in. Big data is also going to create a lot of new linkages. Almost everything I showed you today had one data source, maybe two data sources, right? Measures calculated off insurance claims, or all the measures are part of CMS. Maybe it's one survey that Leapfrog does with a couple other measures. But there's a ton more data out there. Why can't I link Yelp data with CMS measures with local municipal data available about the well-being of a community and construct a completely different rating? And so there's so much new rapid data being collected, and it's all outside the traditional methods that we think about, that that'll create different rating systems. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the measures of quality that go into these, I think the important thing to remember for the vast majority of folks in this room who are clinicians is that we actually create that data, right? And so when you take that extra time at hospital discharge to get a safe discharge so that it reduces the likelihood of a readmission, that is rippling up into a readmission measure, that ripples up into a star rating, that ripples up onto a website and into somebody else's rating system, and eventually back around to something else. And so remembering that these are actually connected to our individual patient experiences and our individual care, I think is hard to do, but it's remarkably important. Because otherwise this stuff feels like it's 10,000 feet away in a cloud. And so I'll stop there, see if folks have any questions. Thank you for having me, and I want to thank our team at CORE that did a lot of work on the star ratings.